I am Emma, 27 years old, working as a web designer. I was born and raised in a small rural town, growing up in a household that included my grandparents, my parents, and my younger sister, Maria. Though we lived under the same roof, the treatment we received was vastly different. Maria, who is 8 years younger than me, was the cherished daughter, the bright star in my parents' eyes. From a young age, she was showered with affection, praise, and every opportunity possible. Her needs, wants, and whims always came first. My parents never hesitated to support her interests, making sure she had everything she needed to succeed. Meanwhile, I was often pushed to the background, treated like an afterthought rather than an equal part of the family. On Maria's birthdays, she received expensive gifts, new clothes, gadgets, and even small celebrations. My birthday, however, fell close to Christmas, so it was always combined with a holiday. While my sister unwrapped multiple presents on her special day, I usually received just one, often something practical like study materials or books. My parents saw no reason to make a fuss over me. When Maria started playing soccer, my parents attended every practice and game, cheering her on from the sidelines, beaming with pride. I, too, had a passion for sports and joined the tennis club in middle school. But even on the day of my final match before graduation, they couldn't be bothered to come. They had to drive Maria somewhere instead. That day, as I stood on the court, looking into the crowd for a familiar face and finding none, I realized how invisible I was to them. Despite everything, I tried to push forward. The unfair treatment stung, but I told myself I had to be strong. There were nights I wanted to cry, nights when I lay awake wondering why I wasn't good enough. But the person who saw me, even when my parents didn't, was Maria. She was the only one who spoke up whenever our parents compared us. "It's not like that," she would say. "Emma is amazing. She's great at studying and teaching. She can do anything." And after my last tennis match, when I was feeling defeated, she came up to me, smiled, and handed me a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked at the park.
"Good job," she whispered.
It was a small gesture, but at that moment, it meant everything. Even our grandparents saw the favoritism. They often tried to defend me, urging my parents to treat me better, to acknowledge my efforts and struggles. But their words rarely made a difference. And then, before anything could change, my grandmother, the one person who truly fought for me, passed away. I learned early on that life isn't always fair. No matter how hard I worked, I would never be Maria in my parents' eyes. But despite their disappointment in me, I've built a life for myself. I may not have gone to a prestigious university like my sister, but I carved out my own path, relying on my skills, determination, and resilience. And now, standing where I am today, I realize something important. My worth isn't defined by their approval. It never was. After graduating from high school, life took an even more difficult turn. Not long after, my grandfather passed away, leaving behind a heavy silence in our home. His absence was deeply felt, especially by me, as he was one of the few people who truly saw me. Through it all, my younger sister, Maria, continued to support me. She stood by my side even when our parents dismissed me, but my mother didn't like that. It seemed she couldn't bear the thought of Maria siding with me, and before long, my mother's harsh words, once directed only at me, were now thrown at Maria as well. "If you're always going to defend your sister, you might as well stand outside too." It was the dead of winter when my mother started using threats like this. The snow piled up outside, and the cold seeped into every corner of our home. I couldn't bear to see Maria being dragged into the same mistreatment I had endured for years. So I made a difficult decision. "You don't have to take my side anymore," I told her. I didn't want her to suffer because of me. I wanted her to have the love and support that had always been denied to me. Eventually, Maria stopped standing up for me. With our parents' full support, she focused on her studies and sports, seemingly enjoying a life that I had never been allowed to have. Meanwhile, things at home only got worse. My parents, burdened by back-to-back funerals and financial struggles, broke the news to me one evening. "We don't have any savings. College isn't an option for you." It felt like a punch to the gut. I had dreamed of studying design at university. I had imagined myself walking across a college campus, learning from experienced professors, and developing the skills that would shape my future. But that dream was crushed in an instant. With no other choice, I started working right after high school. Still, my passion for design refused to fade. Determined to at least work in a creative field, I took an office job at a small design company a little far from my hometown. The company specialized in creating websites for women's services like hair salons and nail salons. It wasn't exactly what I had envisioned, but it was a step in the right direction. I made it clear from the start that I wanted to learn, and I repeatedly asked for more responsibilities. Eventually, I was given the chance to work as an assistant to the professional designers in the office. The work was challenging and the learning curve was steep. There were times when I struggled to keep up, but rather than discouraging me, it fueled my determination. Every day, my goal of becoming a web designer grew stronger. Studying became my lifeline, and I threw myself into it completely. Going back home only meant facing more disappointment and criticism from my parents, so I avoided it as much as possible. Instead, I spent my free time immersing myself in design. On weekends and holidays, I took online courses, steadily improving my software skills. I practiced relentlessly, pushing myself to get better. Eventually, my dedication paid off. I was finally welcomed as a member of the design team. My passion and hard work became evident to my colleagues, and the senior designers in the company began to recognize my potential. They introduced me to valuable resources, shared industry insights, and even connected me with professionals in the field. For years after starting my job, I was trusted with my own projects, working as a full-fledged web designer. Now, 9 years have passed since I graduated from high school. I have built a successful career doing something I love, something I was once told I could never do. I may not have had the same opportunities as my sister. I may not have had the encouragement and praise of my parents. But I created my own path, one step at a time. And in the end, that's what truly matters. One day, I got the news that my sister, Maria, was going to take the university entrance exams. To my surprise, she was aiming for a top medical school in a big city. Maria had always been a hard worker and kept excellent grades, so it seemed almost certain that she would get in. Thinking back to our childhood and how she had always supported me, I felt the urge to do the same for her. I wanted to help in any way I could. A few months later, she got accepted into her first-choice medical school. I was truly happy for her and congratulated her with all my heart. Maria, congratulations. You worked so hard for this. I really admire you. She looked a little embarrassed but smiled and thanked me. Then, she hesitated for a moment before bringing up something that was worrying her. There's a small issue. Since it's a private medical school, there's a suggested donation. It's not required, but Mom and Dad are worried that if they don't contribute, people will think we're poor. But just paying for tuition and living expenses is already a big burden, so I don't know what to do. Maria told me she planned to cover her living expenses by working part-time jobs. But I knew how hard medical school was. Studying would take up most of her time, and working too much could make it difficult for her to keep up with her classes. I wanted to help, but the truth was, we couldn't afford the donation. My father had an office job, and my mother only worked 3 days a week. The cost of a private medical school was already a huge financial strain on our family. What surprised me the most was that instead of asking me directly, my parents had sent Maria to talk to me about the money. Even though I was frustrated by their actions, I didn't want my sister to struggle. So, in the end, I agreed to help pay for the donation and the other entrance fees. With that, Maria moved into an apartment near her university and started her new life as a medical student. Her place wasn't too far from mine, so I thought she could rely on me whenever she needed help. But as time passed, she became more and more distant. Maybe she was just busy with her studies, but her messages to me were short and cold. Even though Maria had become distant, I still got messages from her now and then. But they were never warm or friendly. I want to eat this. I need this. Please buy it for me. She never asked our parents for these things, only me. And each time, I arranged them for her, wanting to support her however I could. Sometimes we met up for meals, but even then, she barely spoke to me. She was always glued to her phone, scrolling or typing, barely acknowledging my presence. If I tried to start a conversation, her response was always the same. Studying is hard. Her cold attitude confused me. She had always been kind to me before, so why was she acting this way now? Even today, it felt like she had only agreed to meet because I had insisted. Hoping to lighten the mood, I brought up our parents with a playful tone. Mom and Dad probably only care about you, though. Maria suddenly looked up and stared at me. Then she let out a small, sharp laugh. Of course. A medical student like me and a high school graduate like you are completely different. No one cares about a job that doesn't need a degree. Her words felt like a slap. My heart dropped. There's no need to say it like that, I said quietly. But it's true, she replied, her voice cold. Being a designer is just a title. Anyone can learn to make websites if they look it up online. It would be better if you had a real qualification, but that might be tough for someone like you who never went to college. I clenched my fists.
It's not that simple, I said.
I study and work hard every single day. You don't even know what I do, so why say something like that? Maria clicked her tongue in annoyance and looked away. Mom and Dad always say that I'm going to a top university and have a bright future, while you didn't even go to college. You're a disappointment, she said bluntly. Then she sighed. I'm only meeting you because they told me to. They said, even though Emma is a failure, make sure she doesn't fall even lower. You, the future doctor, should look after her. Her words cut deep. Our parents had compared us our whole lives. Maria was always the smart, responsible, and talented daughter. I was the clumsy, stupid, and useless one. Hearing those words again after all these years, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My head spun, and all I could do was bow my head and endure it. Maria saw my reaction and must have thought I was crying. She gave a small smile and said, I'm going home now. Then she left without another word. Since moving out and living on her own, Maria had changed completely. Surrounded by brilliant people she had never met back home, she now fully believed in all the praise our parents showered on her. If you hear something every day, it's hard not to believe it. And for years, our parents had told her, Maria is a genius. She will become a top-class doctor. They repeated it over and over, and it became the truth in her mind. But those words always carried something else, an unspoken insult toward me. And it seemed like Maria had naturally adopted the same view. Returning home for the holidays. At the end of the year, I went home for the holidays as usual. This time, my parents asked me to come back with Maria, even though she always treated me coldly. So, we traveled home together. Maria had been extremely busy with her studies and practical training. Since starting university, she hadn't returned home once. Because of that, when we arrived, my parents completely ignored me and focused all their attention on her. The moment we walked in, I saw a table full of treats, steak, pizza, and all her favorite foods. It was a welcome party, just for her. In the evening, neighbors, relatives, and even her old classmates gathered at our house for a big celebration. Maria was clearly enjoying the attention. She smiled as she started boasting loudly to the crowd. Mom keeps telling me to come home more often, but my university is a top-ranked one. It's the hardest medical school, so of course studying is tough. Even though I'm still a student, we have so many team projects, and I can't just leave everything behind to relax at home. People are always contacting me about something. It's honestly exhausting. I stood in the kitchen, pretending to cook, but I could still hear her loud voice echoing through the room. To my parents and relatives, her bragging probably sounded impressive. But to the neighbors and classmates, I could tell it was starting to get annoying. Maybe they were getting tired of hearing Maria talk about herself, because when I brought over some wine, an elderly neighbor suddenly changed the subject. Emma, are you working in design? He asked kindly. But before I could answer, my parents and Maria quickly cut in, speaking over me in unison. Oh, you don't need to ask about her, my mother said dismissively. She's trying, but really, she couldn't even go to college. She's a total disappointment, completely different from her sister. I looked around the room. Many of the people there hadn't gone to college either. Some were parents with young children, Others had been working since high school, just like me. Yet, instead of speaking up, everyone stayed quiet. They didn't want to ruin the atmosphere of the party. Only my parents and Maria remained completely unaware of how uncomfortable their words had made everyone feel. And as I stood there, the same painful words I had heard my whole life echoed in my mind once again. The breaking point. I felt awkward and just wanted to leave without saying anything. But before I could go, Maria suddenly stopped me. "You still come home a lot, don't you, Emma?" she said, smirking. "I'm doing great in university, so I don't feel embarrassed. Maybe you can act so bold because you don't think about anything." Then she burst out laughing, and our parents joined in. "If you say things like that, it's going to hurt her." "How pitiful," my mother added, still laughing. The moment I heard those words, anger burned inside me. "I guess it's better if I don't come back next year," I said, forcing out the words. Some relatives and neighbors looked at me with concern, but no one spoke up. I quietly set down the tray I was holding and went to get my coat and bag. Maria and my parents watched me as I got ready to leave. I took a deep breath and looked at them one last time. I understand how everyone feels. I won't come back to this house anymore. I felt nothing toward them anymore. No sadness, no regret, just pure anger. And as I walked out, the three of them waved cheerfully. "Don't come back again." Even as I walked toward the station, I had to fight to keep my emotions under control. A decision to cut ties. Going home had always been difficult for me. When I was younger, I used my dream of becoming a web designer as an excuse to keep my distance from my parents. But as I grew older and became more stable in my career, I found it harder to completely cut ties with them. Maria was still a university student. She was young, and maybe she didn't understand how hard it was to work and survive in society. Still, I couldn't excuse her behavior. Our parents had always done things their own way, but their favoritism toward Maria never changed. They continued to praise her as a genius while looking down on me. That night, I finally realized something. If I truly valued my work and my life, I couldn't keep this relationship going, not even with my own parents. Maria's words, her attitude, and the way my parents treated me, it all made my decision clear. I was done with them. That was the moment I decided to cut ties with my family. An unexpected call. Months passed after I made that decision. Then, out of nowhere, I got a phone call from Maria. At first, I ignored it, but she kept calling and sending messages, insisting that I pick up. Since I hadn't blocked her, I reluctantly answered. The first thing she said shocked me. "Did you pay my tuition properly?" Her voice was slow, but had a sense of urgency. I stayed calm and replied, "I already paid for the donation and the entrance fee before you started school." There was a pause. Then she asked, "What about this year's tuition?" "The university is demanding payment." I didn't even hesitate. "I don't know anything about that." Even over the phone, I could tell that Maria was speechless. And she had every reason to be. I had already drained my savings once to give her a large amount of money. But that was in the past. I wasn't going to do it again. A one-sided relationship. I had already paid for Maria's entrance fee, donation, and the first year of tuition. My savings were almost gone, but I had planned to cover more payments as they became due. However, after what happened at the end of the year, I couldn't believe they had the nerve to ask me for more money. They had told me not to come home. Yet now, they expected me to pay for Maria's tuition? I was only asked to cover a donation, right? I said firmly. "I paid the other amounts because I wanted to support you. But didn't Mom and Dad send you to an expensive private university because they could afford it? Or did they send you without having the monies?" Maria hesitated. "That's not it. I have a lot of rich friends, so I have expenses beyond just living costs. Mom and Dad somehow manage those extra costs, but that's why they don't have money left for tuition. So they told me to ask you." I felt disgusted. The truth was, I had been able to help Maria because I had worked hard to advance in my career. I had switched to a bigger design company, and my skills were recognized. My salary had increased significantly, and since I was always busy with work, I rarely spent my money. This allowed my savings to grow. I had mentioned my job change to my parents before, so they must have planned to rely on me from the start. Once they realized I could afford not just the donation but also the tuition, they probably used the money meant for her education on her luxury expenses instead. Maybe I had been too trusting, but I no longer had the heart to forgive them. Supporting her tuition wasn't difficult for me financially, but I refused. They only wanted my money. A few days later, my parents called me, demanding that I pay for Maria's tuition. Their voices were urgent and accusing, as if I had done something wrong. I refused again. With every phone call, I felt more drained. It became painfully clear I wasn't a family member to them. I was just a source of money.
They didn't care about me.
They only cared about what I could give them. Maria, on the other hand, started calling me almost every day. If she had shown any real regret, if she had even once apologized, maybe I could have considered helping her again. But instead, all I heard were selfish demands. Please pay my tuition. If you don't, I'll be expelled. Scholarships and part-time jobs aren't enough. It would be a waste if a promising student like me had to leave school, right? I'll pay you back when I start working, so please help me as family. Her voicemails were filled with nothing but entitlement. There were even ridiculous messages like, if you're upset because mom and dad told you not to come home, I can try to convince them to change their minds, as if I would trade my dignity for their fake acceptance. Moving on from the past, I saved Maria's messages in a separate file and deleted everything else from my phone. After that, I sent her one last message and then blocked her number. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they can treat you badly. No one wants to be looked down on or used. And with that, I completely cut off communication with my family. As spring arrived, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known before. Maria's downfall. Later, I heard from a relative that Maria had somehow managed to pay for her second year of tuition using scholarships and loans from family members. But since she no longer had financial support for her living expenses, she had to start working part-time. However, balancing work with the intense study schedule of medical school was harder than she expected. The pressure of exams and practical training became overwhelming, and after struggling for months, she started failing her classes. 7 months later, she had to drop out of university. For years, I had not only paid her tuition but also sent money home. But after I cut ties, all financial support stopped. With no money left and no backup plan, Maria had no choice but to return home. Even though she had always been a top student, transferring to another university was impossible without money. But instead of working locally or trying to fix her situation, she shut herself in her room, spending all day playing video games and venting her stress by lashing out at night. A friend who lived nearby told me that the sounds of shouting and arguments could be heard from my parents' house almost every day. The same parents who once adored Maria were now completely helpless. They didn't know how to deal with the daughter they had spoiled for so long. The collapse of my parents. One day, I happened to run into my parents by chance. They looked completely drained, exhausted from everything that had happened. Even the neighbors, perhaps feeling awkward about the situation, hardly spoke to them anymore. Then something even worse happened. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe it was just his true nature, but my father caused a serious incident on his way to work. While on the train, he groped a woman standing next to him. Other passengers caught him in the act, and he was taken away by the police. Fortunately for him, a settlement was reached, and he avoided criminal charges. But the damage was done. His coworkers found out, and the shame of the incident forced him to resign. With my father unemployed, my mother had to start working. But since she had only ever worked part-time before, finding a stable job that paid well was nearly impossible. No more second chances. At times, my parents tried to contact me through relatives. But their messages were always the same, selfish demands, expecting me to help them again. Eventually, even our relatives grew tired of their attitude. We'll handle things here. Don't worry about them, they told me before completely cutting off contact on my behalf. And just like that, I had finally severed all ties with my family. For the first time in my life, I could live peacefully, without the weight of my past holding me down. Moving forward while they fall apart, I heard that things at my old home had only gotten worse. My sister Maria was still a recluse, locked away in her room all day. My father, now unemployed, had gained a bad reputation in the neighborhood. Rumors spread quickly, and people avoided them even more than before. As for my mother, frustrated with everything, she had disappeared. No one knew where she went, and no one could contact her. Now, with no one left to rely on, my father and Maria were barely surviving. Neither of them worked, and from what I was told, their living situation was almost like homelessness. If they had treated their neighbors with even a little kindness in the past, maybe someone would have stepped in to help. But after all the things they had done, no one was willing to support them. A future of my own. Meanwhile, my life was completely different. I was successfully building my career as a designer. I had recently been chosen for a major project, one that would make my name known in the industry. It was a huge opportunity, and it gave me even more motivation to push forward. For a long time, I had wanted to go to university, but circumstances had never allowed it. Now, with stable savings and my current project wrapping up, I finally had the chance. I decided to take the entrance exams. Not only that, but I also planned to study business management. In the future, I wanted to start my own company and work independently. This new challenge excited me more than anything. For the first time in my life, I wasn't weighed down by the past. I was looking ahead, eager to see what I could accomplish next.